Well, good afternoon, everybody. Can you hear me? I seem to be bouncing a bit here. Yeah, can you hear me? Welcome to Gresham College, and starting my new sort of batch of lectures for the new year. I'm going to start with animal senses, as you know. And firstly, and just in this lecture, I'm going to deal with how we and at least some other species do actually experience the world around us, in order really to provide some kind of basis upon which to go for the next lecture next month, which will be in much more detail as to how we and at least some other animals recognize each other, and for example, animals can recognize us as well. And finally, onto the much more tricky area in the third lecture of this particular series, which is to examine our respective capacities for self-awareness. So I'm sure we all have some kind of idea about what animals really do sense in the world, and maybe birds really do see us all with targets on the head or body, but life, of course, is nothing quite as simple as that. And the first thing that's really important to understand, although it may seem very obvious, but you have to think about it, is that senses only interpret what's out there. They can only interpret all the different energy forms that are around us. And as such, they're extremely subjective for that reason. And so we end up with what is a very subjective but comforting, of course, illusion of what we think is absolute reality. But in truth of fact, it can be experienced very, very differently, not only by different humans, but also by one other animal species, for example, compared to ourselves. So the external world, or at least the energies in it that our sense organs are capable of picking up, can and are experienced in many, many different ways. Only, of course, our good selves have had the ability, the ingenuity, to develop sensors outside of our own biological range. And of course the whole point is that no animal species, including ourselves, develop sensors they don't need to survive. Sense capacities are evolved in the same way as every other aspect of behavior. We, of course, have managed to provide ourselves with video cameras, seismographs, infrared night vision, magnetic resonance imaging, compasses, radio telescopes. The list is enormous. But for all of that ingenuity, of course, biological evolution is never really far behind what we can do with our brains. And in fact, in a lot of cases, other species have developed biological capacities to do what we can only do with very sophisticated artificial sensors. And in some cases, actually, they're better at doing it than we are with our machines. So we're going to look through the different senses and how they're used by us and by different animals. So you're going to get a little bit of a sort of background as to how they work, but it will be fairly superficial. And the 5 primary senses, that I'm sure most of us have got even from back in early primary school, are, as we know, touch, taste, smell. Men always have to have a few jokes in here somewhere. Very important for attraction, of course. Hearing, and of course the one that we are most dependent on, sight. And as you can see, our eyes come in a phenomenal range of different appearances, and they're very emotive stimuli for us as they are for other species that can see. Of course, there are other senses. I'm not going to cover all of them. We'd be here for several hours. But there's balance, of course, which is absolutely essential for us and all animals. One that I will cover is the ability to sense magnetic fields. One that I won't in this particular lecture, because it's fairly esoteric, is the ability of some electric fish and sharks, for example, to self-generate electric fields which allow them to be able to detect other objects or animals coming in to that field by the disturbance that it causes. But it's not something you see in land mammals. And by a sonar, you can hear a background there, insect between bats, and also a lot of cetaceans like whales and dolphins used by a sonar to localize things. And of course, although I really won't spend an awful lot of time on it, one can't really ignore the fact that there's a huge amount of effort designed at trying to understand whether there are extrasensory, if you like, perceptions, telepathy. And it's often been claimed, for example, that these are much more prevalent abilities of animals to communicate with one another by telepathy or psychic energies. Because they're closer to nature than our good selves, the argument is that we've actually lost that ability through losing our contact with nature. And just to sort of put the whole thing in context as far as other animal species are concerned, there are some fantastic claims about what animals can do, and I'm only going to scratch on some of them here. But what I'm really trying to do is to give you some examples where I hope the rest of the lecture, by showing you the different sensory abilities that animals have, that some of these things can be simply explained by these different sensory abilities rather than some kind of supernatural ability that animals may have. And this is probably not one of them, I hasten to say, right from the beginning. There's a huge amount of work, if you read the book by Rupert Sheldrake that I've recommended, showing particularly dogs but also cats appear to have the ability to know when their owners just literally form an intention to come home, not that they're coming in the garden gate or something like that, and they can be hundreds or thousands of miles away. Detecting, for example, illnesses such as cancer, or warning owners, this is mostly dogs, of impending epileptic attacks or high blood pressure. Detecting emotional states in others, for example, fear particularly. Detecting hormonal states in others. Detecting when a female, for example, is in ovulation, but equally animals being able to detect when human females actually are ovulating. Detecting the presence of buried objects, such as the truffle pigs here, but also you can have the example of St. Bernards digging in the snow to find buried humans or other animals. Amazing examples of animals being able to trace their owners or companions who are not at home, they've gone somewhere distant, and making long journeys to be reunited with them. Alternatively, particularly migratory species, actually finding their way back home from enormous distances, often thousands of miles, and often just to a specific place. Also detecting things that we can't detect. For example, electromagnetic fields, such as is being sort of visualized here in the water. Ultrasonic, but also infrasonic frequencies, sound frequencies. Infrared and also ultraviolet light frequencies. Locating objects using sonar, using things like sun compasses, or even reading celestial maps. And another one which many of us have heard of, animals appearing to be able to sense far better than we can, things like impending storms and earthquakes and so forth. Now, before actually looking in more detail at each specific sense and some of these extra senses I'm talking about, let's just try to give you an impression of really how all mammals, how their nervous systems, in fact most other species, are really organized to deal with energy from the outside world and to interpret it. Just to give you a sort of generic sensory system, this is how they all tend to work. And you start right at the beginning with almost the most important cells we have. These are sensory receptors. And what they do is capture energy and convert them into the language of our nervous systems, that is, into electrical impulses, so that they can be interpreted by our brains. And there are a whole host of them. So, for example, there are chemical receptors, particularly smell and taste. They can actually latch on to specific chemical molecules and turn that into electrical energy, convert and send it to the brain. There are so-called mechanoreceptors, such as this hair cell in the skin here, where literally mechanical displacement of that, when you're touched, or for example also in the ear, the hearing, will also set up electrical energy which can be sent to the brain. Thermoreceptors, originally thought just for heat, but they also recently suggested that there are cold thermoreceptors as well. Nociceptors I won't talk about today, but they're obviously highly important. They're what help us to realize that whatever energy form is impinging on us is actually causing damage to us and we should avoid it. photoreceptors, allowing us to detect light and different wavelengths of it. And a little bit more controversially, but we're going to understand more and more about these, also magnetoreceptors capable of allowing animals at least to detect changes in the Earth's magnetic fields, and possibly also magnetic fields that are generated by biological organisms. As I said, all they do is they actually transduce, that's a technical word for it, they convert a specific form of known energy into electrical impulses, the traffic, if you like, of our nervous systems and those of animals. And a very important principle is that, for the most part, if you want to have greater sensitivity in any particular sense or any part of your body, what you do is pack in more receptors. All these receptors I've just been talking about. You don't end up developing a receptor that's much more sensitive. And the reason for that is because pretty much all of us have already got the most sensitive receptor, whether it be for a couple of photons of light or for a couple of chemical molecules that you can possibly devise. So the only way, in most part, not always, but for the most part, of getting more sensitivity is to pack in more receptors. So you end up with a bigger sense organ or area of it that is responding to the energy. And of course, importantly, there has to be a protection mechanism in this. They're all designed to be very sensitive, but they're also designed to protect themselves. So too much intensity in any sense organ will cause pain. The other important thing about the way senses work is, what are they really trying to do? And what they're really trying to do is to detect change. That's what they're really focused on, not what's going on constantly in the background. And for that reason, all of these receptors actually adapt, either slowly or rapidly, to constant stimuli. So, for example, you're not likely to be terribly aware of every article of clothing that you're wearing. Your skin has become adapted to it. And this is the same with all of the senses. And so really what's important for any animal species for adaptability is to detect changes in the environment. So we're not really great in terms of what a machine can do in detecting the same thing again and again and again and again, which is often why we tend to create electronic or artificial sensory systems which don't have this adaptability built into them, so that they can be used for routine checking of the same thing again and again and again, which our biological systems are not that great at. So all of these receptors convey their information, because they're all on the outside, or at least they're away from the brain. They convey these to the brain via sensory nerves. And they do so in such a way that the pattern of activation, the capture of the energy, the pattern in your eye or your ear or your tongue, for example, or the receptors in your nose, that is faithfully maintained in the organization of these sensory nerve fibers. That's why there are thousands of them, all the way to the brain. So your brain ends up with a faithful, both spatial and temporal map of exactly what happened in the receptors in the periphery. So, as I said, the brain therefore ends up with a lovely, precise spatial and temporal map of what happened in each sense organ. But the interesting thing about it is that it's not all impinging on the same part of the brain. Each sensory system has its own sort of reception module in the brain. So vision is at the back here, for example. Touch is in this purple area here, the somatosensory cortex. Hearing is a tiny area down here, auditory cortex. Smell underneath here. And these are all, as I say, completely separate from one another. And just as with the receptors, what's important is that greater sensitivity results in more brain being devoted to the process of interpreting those signals. So there is a cost here. If you want to be very, very sensitive to something, you're going to have to end up dedicating a lot of very expensive brain tissue in terms of energy consumption to actually dealing with it. And okay, yes, there are parts of the brain, particularly in the front here, where everything comes together, or at least a number of senses come together, and that provides some form of integration. And they're particularly the ones that are close to the parts of the brain that are controlling memory and action. But you don't have to wait for the information to get there to be aware of it. That's the important take-home message. So it actually means that we end up with multiple centers of awareness. Each of our sensory systems is capable of being detected separately, physically separately by the brain. It's almost kind of schizophrenic kind of idea that it's not all a Unitarian. We have 5 or more different, if you like, levels of awareness, spatial awareness in the brain of the different forms of energy that are around us. And if you like, to be a little bit sort of more controversial, what we're doing is we're having multiple, that's independent and illusory because they are interpretational, interpretations of what we think is reality. And that goes for all other animals. So let's deal now with some specific senses, and we'll start off with the biggest one in many ways, which is touch. We have over 50 square feet of skin, millions of touch receptors in it, and these are the ones I've already mentioned to you, the mechanoreceptors, which are sensing pressure on the skin, but we've also got specialized receptors in the skin for heat, for cold, for pain, for itching, as well as for pressure, but I'm not going to talk about those. The body pressure, the touch receptors, the sense of touch as we know it, actually owes a lot to understanding from Wilder Penfield here, a surgeon, who first, with the human brain, actually electrically stimulated parts of the brain to find out that you could create what are called, in this case, somatotopic maps, touch maps, which could show that if you stimulated a part of the brain, you would get a sensation of touch in a particular part of your body, or for that matter, it would move, because another area of the brain right next to it is controlling motor responses. And he was able to map out, and this has been done in lots of species, the representation of the different body organs along this narrow strip, you can see in the green here, in the human brain of somatosensory cortex. And you can see here we have the tongue, jaw, huge amounts for the face, big for the hand, and for the genitals. You notice, in fact, that it's the face, the tongue, and the hand and the genitals that are considerably more represented in this area than the whole of the major of the rest of our bodies. And this is because these are our most sensitive organs. And indeed, as far as the brain is concerned, if we actually translated that into what the brain thinks, at least the brain touch system thinks we look like, then that's what we look like. This is the so-called homunculus with huge great lips and tongue and hands and genitals. Okay? So hopefully we don't feel we look like that when we look at each other or look at ourselves in the mirror. Now, all of the sensory systems, and touch particularly, you're not just sort of fixed in concrete. You can change the representation in the brain of a particular body part. And one example of this, an experimental one, is, whoops, let's go back now, is this example where a monkey here has repeatedly been using its second digit in a behavioral task. And this has resulted in the normal representation of this second digit here is fairly similar to the other digits within this area of the somatosensory cortex. But after all this experience, it only takes a few months, it's hugely increased in terms of its representation. And in fact, there seems to be a competition, if you like, and the brain is squashed for space, whatever you look at. And what is happening is that if you have juxtaposing areas that are represented, they are very much in competition. So, for example, if you have the misfortune of having an amputation of your whole arm, which obviously includes the hand and the digits, this area is right next to the area which is controlling touch sensitivity in the face. And individuals that have had this, for example, have reported that when they are touched on the face, it gives them a sensation of being touched in their missing hand or arm. There's an example for that. Another, perhaps more risque example is this one at this end, which is individuals who have lost a whole leg, for example, or even just their foot. This is right next to the area of the genitals. And a male, for example, has reported when he had orgasm that he not only felt orgasm in his genital region, but it appeared to be translated up his phantom limb as well, his leg and his foot. And it's been argued by some neurosurgeons, such as Ramachandran, that indeed the juxtaposition of feet and genitals may explain foot fetishes, for example, because of the proximity with them. I won't go into that in more detail, but nevertheless, there is a sort of dynamism and competition between these areas, so it doesn't matter who's represented next to who else, as far as the brain is concerned. Now let's look at some other animals, and these are the sort of stars, if you like, of the touch world. Some of you probably may have seen in Attenborough's programs recently. This is the famous star-nosed mole that uses this arrangement here to not only find its way around, but actually to catch and manipulate insects and so forth to actually put it in its mouth. It's a very, very useful organ for this obviously nocturnal subterranean animal to have. And that's what the animal looks like in reality, but in terms of the way its brain is organized, its touch brain is concerned, that is what it looks like. Huge amount of brain dedicated just to processing its nose. In fact, over 20% of its entire brain cortex is developed to doing that. And also its hands, which are important. Another mole, similar kind of thing, huge representation of the head, in particular the nose. You notice the whiskers, which are very, very useful for a lot of rodent species, and the hands again. And this is the tiny masked shrew, again, massive representation of the whiskers and the head compared to the rest of the body. So you can really tell quite a lot about what these animals find important by how much of their brain is dedicated to dealing with information coming from various parts of their bodies. Indeed, if we want to put some numbers on this, the star-nosed mole actually has 100,000 touch receptors in its nose, which is at least 6 times the maximum you've got in your fingertips. Raccoons, of course, which have often mentioned in this context, are very similar. I won't show you the actual data for it, but they have extremely sensitive hands, which are capable, again, of finding prey underwater, as well as, of course, as we all know, from dustbins. They have, again, a huge representation of their hands in their cortex. Now, these extra senses of touch, of course, will help the animal do what it has to do, but at the same time, they're going to provide them with enhanced abilities to detect things like vibrations from the earth, be very, very much more easy to pick up, or changes in wind direction and things like the velocity of the wind as well. So they'll have some other sort of advantages in terms of sensing what's going on in the environment compared to ourselves. But the other thing, of course, there is a downside. You turn up the gain in a particular system, you also turn up the potential for pain. So they are going to be much more sensitive to pain in these particular parts of their bodies. And moving along from that to the other senses, which animals are well known in many ways to have greater sensitivities than ourselves, particularly smell anyway, but taste and smell should really be considered in this context together. They are clearly the senses that are of greatest importance for survival in most mammals, particularly in terms of detecting what's good or bad to eat. Without them, you'll find that extremely difficult. And in fact, they sometimes at least work in combination, which is how we experience flavour, and it's how animals experience flavour as well. Flavour is actually a mixture of taste and smell perception, and also, in fact, touch on the tongue. But the interesting thing is that the taste sensitivity is much, much less than smell. In fact, when you appreciate flavour, probably 75% of that is smell, which is why when you have a cold, you seem to lose your sense of taste. And equally, if you decide to sort of hold on to your nose and you put a potato pit or an apple in your mouth, you won't be able to tell the difference between them, but you'll have no trouble if you unblock your nose. The receptors for this are these papillae, just shown with a rather garish-looking blue tongue here. You can see these little spots here. These are the taste receptors, and this is a schematic of them, which they're opened up and pores in the tongue, but they're actually present in pretty much every part of the mouth, not just the tongue. And these detect the different chemicals in things that we eat. And if you actually look at the way that our tongues, and for that matter other species' tongues, are organized, we have areas of maximum, and I must say this, maximum sensitivity to particular classes of tastons. In fact, all of the different classes of taste receptors are expressed all over the tongue. But in terms of what's maximal sensitivity, salt is mainly detected by the end of the tongue, here in this yellow area. Sugars right at the tip. Sour and the sides, and bitter alkaloids at the back. And there are actually two other taste receptor classes as well. One's called umami, which we don't know whether it has a special increased sensitivity area. This is for glutamate, amino acids, meat-like tastes. And recently it's been claimed that there may actually be fat detectors in the tongue as well. Again, we don't know whether they're localized anywhere. As far as we know, animals have a pretty similar distribution. But the important thing is that if we look just for ourselves, you'll notice that bitter quinine-type tastes are about 100 times more sensitive than the nice things in life, the sugars and the salts. And that is simply because this system, whether you're a human or another species, is primarily there to detect poisons, to stop you killing yourself. Okay? It's not just for the good things in life. Receptors in this case are connected to the brain via specific cranial nerves, and the processing of taste, I won't go into detail, but is actually in a tiny area of the gustatory cortex, which is right next to the part of the somatosensory cortex which deals with the tongue. There's a huge variation, in fact, on the genetic control, it would appear, of taste sensitivity in ourselves, and we assume, therefore, possibly in other species as well. So there are the super tasters, quarter of the human population, who have over 1,000 taste buds per square centimetre, and they're really exquisitely sensitive to bitter and sweet tastes, which means they actually find aversive the kinds of things we often get in processed foods, which are often high in salt and sugar. So they're really overweight. The majority of us have about half of that. But right down the bottom here, we have a quarter of the population who only have about 1/10 of those numbers, and they are very insensitive to bitter and sweet tastes, and they tend, therefore, to overindulge in these foods to get the same kind of high, and so they're much more likely to be overweight. And in fact, there is a sex difference in this. Females actually are the ones with the greater sense of taste, with Judy Goulden here, than males, whether in fact it's taste or smell. And that's why the genes for these receptors are apparently on the X chromosome. And why should they be? Well, the answer to that, again, seems to be to protect the woman, in this case, from administering poisons to her baby. So to actually protect, because the baby is much more sensitive to poisons than, of course, the adult is. And recent theories are that, for example, morning sickness is associated with, if you have it, it's associated with a lower risk of miscarriage. And it's now thought, for example, that morning sickness may be a generalized food aversion to both vegetables, it's not just meats, and meats, which are likely to contain low levels of toxins. And it happens at a particular point of pregnancy when the baby's organs are growing, which is when they're most sensitive to toxic damage. It's a theory still, but may explain it, maybe even make some people feel better. Perhaps not. Some mammals are undoubtedly more sensitive to taste than we are. And the rabbit, for example, has, on its small tongue, 17,000 taste receptors, pigs 15,000. Our total is about 9,000. But the thing is that really this sense is probably still the least well understood. And so we can't really tell too much about the different capabilities of other species compared to ourselves, except that there's no clear basis for any assumption that we are the superstars of the taste world. In fact, quite the opposite. What about smell? Well, yeah, we all know that particularly dogs are much more dependent on this sense than we are. But there are actually two different detection systems, and they may have evolved completely separately in the brains of mammals. The first of these, the most primitive one, is actually a system for detecting what are called pheromones, chemical messengers. And they are dissolved in liquids. They are born in liquids, carried in liquids, such as the urine, saliva, and glandular secretions. And they're detected while they're still in this liquid form. The other one that we are far more familiar with is smells or chemicals that are actually carried in the air, airborne odours. Both systems are remarkable in that they have huge numbers of receptors, and that explains in many ways why less of the brain has to be dedicated to analysing smells, because a lot of the processing is actually done in the nose, in the receptors, before it ever gets to the brain. Unlike the visual system, which only has a couple of receptors at the end of the day, and it has to do all the computation in the brain, so it has to dedicate a lot more space to that task. All of this, though, allows even us to detect something like 10,000 different smells. They really are well adapted to it, but of course other species are even better than we are. As far as the pheromone system is concerned, it's a very primitive one, and it never actually ever impinges on our brain cortex. So it's pretty much likely to be a very unconscious sense, something that'll cause an automatic reaction in an animal, and if we use it, the theory is it would do the same in us. The receptors for this are the so-called vomeronasal organ in the roof of the mouth between the nose. It's a hamster here, and they project to a tiny little part of the brain here in the front. This is all smell in the rodent down the back here. And then right down to the parts of the brain, and I'll show you in a moment, that are dealing with sex, hormones, and emotion. This is where it's thought to be in a human, right, again here between the roof of the mouth and the nose. So the brain projections from this system, as I say, are routed straight to the areas of the brain that are controlling the sort of basic things of life. And, for example, male pigs and hamsters have to smell pheromones through this system from a female in order to actually get sexually attracted to them at all. It's an automatic reaction. They smell it, they're attracted. There's no way out. Female mice use it to also remember the male that had sex with them, but in this case the remembrance isn't some sort of conscious memory. Oh yeah, I know you, you're the one I had sex with last week. In this case, you had sex with them last week and you got pregnant, and if you meet another male, what happens is that, oh, there's a mismatch, and your endocrine system suddenly says, whoop, I better not carry the baby, I'll abort it. So you have hormone changes and it causes an abortion because the animal's not aware of this. But that's exactly what the pheromone memory system will do in this case. In humans, it's often startlingly referred to as the sixth sense and is one that is speculated about hugely. And you can imagine why. The idea that you could actually put in a bottle something that you put on a male or a female and you have an absolutely irreversible attraction effect on the opposite sex might have some kind of commercial advantage. As far as the airborne system is concerned, as I say, there are approximately 1,000 different receptors located. This is the human epithelium, in olfactory epithelium in the nose. This is what it looks like if you stain it and show the nerves coming out of it. Other species, though, have much, much bigger, larger olfactory epitheliums, and this is the receptor, the idea that you have to need lots more receptors to get more sensitivity. This is exactly what happens. Here's our friend German Shepherd, 150 centimeters square. Cat, much smaller animal, remember, 14 centimeters square, and actually as an adult human would have 4 centimeters square. But if you translate that, allowing for size, into the receptor numbers, whoa, German Shepherd 220 million, cat 60 million, we've only got 6 million. And it probably therefore won't surprise you when I tell you that in fact this allows the German Shepherd to have 1,000-fold at least more sensitivity to smells than us. And also the cat's pretty good, but it's nothing like as good as the dog. Just like the touch system, although it's a lot more complicated, and I don't intend to go into detail on this, odours are also spatially mapped in the part of the brain which is specifically receiving smell signals. So all the different, you don't have to look at these are different chemical groups, that's all. All you need to look at is the colours, and you can see that they're all spatially distinct from one another and represented at the level of this olfactory structure. And this just shows in a mouse brain using optical imaging the different responses to 4 different odours, a red-coloured one, the actual, this is the dyes rather than what the odours are, green and blue. And you can see they're beautifully bilaterally expressed in a very discrete spatial part of the olfactory system. But it's also a very strong emotional sense, in that it has the information is very quickly routed to the parts of the brain that deal with emotion in the amygdala, and also attention and action here. And they're also parts of the brain dealing with memory. And I'm sure we all know that it's pretty difficult to smell something without feeling a corresponding feeling of some either pleasure or disgust. And that's exactly what it must be like for other species. It's almost impossible not to respond to a particular smell with some emotional reaction. But probably what you know less about is that it's a very, very good system for remembering things. You remember smells far better probably than any other sense, and probably the animals do as well. And just to give you an example of that in humans, if you learn something in a room and there's actually a background smell in it, say lemon, for example, it has nothing to do with the task you're doing. But if I gave you lemon later on, it's likely to trigger all of the memory for the event that you were doing completely separate to it. It seems to have a phenomenal ability, smell, to trigger or to both memories as well as emotions. And that is, of course, in a sense, what is the root of aromatherapy, which I won't go into it, but lots of these different smells, of course, can have very emotive or memorable or stress-relieving even effects. Smell, of course, can be used to detect and localize smells over very, very long distances, but particularly because the wind's got to be in the right direction, doesn't it? I mean, it's a slight problem with long-distance communication with smell. And so really it comes into its own as we see the video of the bloodhound down here following human footsteps, when it's actually applied at short distances in odour trails. And because these animals are remarkable of being able to follow odour trails even left many days before. But what must it be like for a dog? I wish I could sort of give you a picture, but I hope if you understand really how the smell system works, you start to get an idea. And the first thing is that, because we are not really aware of smells most of the time. It's only when they're quite strong that suddenly you think, oh, well, that smells something. Or you go into a new environment. For a dog, on the other hand, it must be like being constantly bombarded with change in your smell system. So it's going to be what you're going to be, the dog's going to be aware of almost all the time, whereas we're only aware of it very infrequently. The other thing is that when they're actually smelling things, this is linked to the emotional parts of their brain, so it's going to be sort of like a constant series of pleasure almost. Or for that matter, something they don't like, but for the most part, pleasure. And this clearly will motivate them to continue to follow, even trace odours. And it must be something that is really a very pleasurable experience for them, because of the nature of the way the olfactory system is actually evolved in the brain. The other thing, of course, that it can do is it's so sensitive that every time that we experience emotion, we get adrenaline changes, or if our immune systems are functioning because we're not well, this causes changes in really 7 or so different chemical groups in our bodies, which, okay, we have difficulty picking up, but I'm sure dogs don't have any. And this is why they will be able to detect quite easily just the biochemical changes in our bodies that are occurring as a result of fear or even pleasure, or, for example, changes in hormones, or, of course, disease. And it doesn't sort of, perhaps I should say that in the past, doctors actually used to use smell as part of their diagnostic kit. Not anymore, I hasten to say. You take a blood sample or a urine sample and you whap it off to the analytical lab to actually measure the chemicals. But in fact, we still have a very sensitive sense of smell, and it can be used to detect diseases, for example, as well as emotional states, which is why there's a huge amount of interest in the development of electronic noses based on what we know about the functioning of biological smell systems, and they're very effective. So let's move on up, if you like, up the order of things, and we'll start dealing now with hearing. Now, although it's quite small here, this is just really to show you that this is supposed to be the human hearing range in the middle here. And you'll see that large numbers of animals actually can hear above the frequencies in ultrasound areas that we can't hear at all, above, in our case, above 20 kilohertz. And similarly, a number of species, whales and elephants, in fact, can hear in the infrasound region, below 20 hertz. And this, of course, is the area where a lot of natural phenomena, such as earthquakes, storms and so forth, they also resonate in this region. So if you can hear in it, you should be able to detect them far better than we could. To look very briefly at the way the ear works, and I promise you it will be very briefly, you have sound pressure, sound waves if you want to call them that, entering the ear. This is the same for all mammals. And they set up pressure on the eardrum, the tympanic membrane, which vibrates these funny shaped ear bones in the middle ear, so-called malleus, incus, and stapes, hammer, anvil, stirrup, as they're called more generically. They have little muscles in between them as well, which we can actually control. And this sets up a magnification of the vibration, and also it diminishes it to vibrate the oval window at the other side of the ears, and this transmits the vibrations into the cochlea, which has in it a basilar membrane, which has thousands of those hair cells that I showed you, those mechanoreceptor cells on it. And here they are on the basilar membrane, but if you look at the way it's constructed, it starts off nearest the ear, very thick, in fact, and fat, and then it widens out and thins out towards the other side. And the different frequencies resonate at different parts of this membrane. So you've got a beautiful spatial map in the ear of all the different frequencies of sound waves, starting with the highest frequency ones, with the thick fat bit, which you can vibrate with ultrasonics, for example, in other species. So in our case, up to maybe 20 kilohertz. And at the other end, where it's thin and it wobbles, it's better for low vibrations, down to 20 kilohertz. So that's the way that we actually, at the ear and all the other animals, sort out the different frequencies of sound. Interestingly, though, that's the way you hear everything, but you don't hear yourself that way. So when I'm listening to myself here, I know what I sound like, and then I go away and I listen to a recording of myself and I say, that's not me. And the reason that I say it's not me is because what I do is when I speak, I and most other species, what they do is we actually constrict the muscles on those ear bones that I mentioned. So we actually can't hear very well. So it really is, don't speak when you're being spoken to. It really is important. You don't do that because you can't hear very well. And what you do is you actually hear yourself through your head bones instead. Okay, that's why you sound different when you're hearing yourself speak as opposed to when you're hearing yourself recorded. Just like the other sensory systems, they're exquisite maps. They map that pattern that you've got in the basilar membrane now at the level of the brain. So in the human brain, for example, it's quite a small area of cortex here, the primary auditory cortex and the temporal lobe here. Different parts of this are dealing with ascending frequencies in the same way that the membrane in the ear is. But if you compare that little representation with what you get in an echolocating bat, which really has to make an awful lot of sound information, you can see huge amounts of brain are dedicated to various different aspects of its sound spectrum. Particularly, I'll come to it a bit later, one particular frequency here, 60 kilohertz, which is an ultrasonic kilohertz, which is the actual frequency it uses most to detect echoes coming back from its calls. Of course, the other thing about hearing is it's the most directional sense in many ways, and we can detect, and so can animals, the phase differences of sounds reaching the two ears with the head acting as a shadow. But of course it depends what sort of frequencies are best for you will depend how big your head is for that reason. And so a mouse is advantaged in the sense that it can hear anything from sort of 12 to 20 kilohertz and less this way, because it's got a small head, whereas we can only hear 2 kilohertz or less, which is a good reason why mice speak with very high frequencies and we don't. It's as simple as that. If you've got a big head, you don't speak for the very sort of high frequency sounds because you can't localize them very well. So human hearing, just to reiterate, is 20 to 40 hertz at the low end and up to 15 to 20 kilohertz at the top end. basic elephant communicating. Now you can hear a bit of it, but it's actually much more complicated than that, because a lot of it is below our systems. It's at a lower frequency. And this kind of sound actually be transmitted through buildings. It is very, very difficult to bounce off anything, so it can go huge distances. That's why these guys can actually, for example, 5 or 10 kilometers up the sounds, for example, at that kind of distance. Indeed, it's been calculated they have a hearing range, depending on the time of day, it's anything between 100 and 500 square kilometers. Now, if you're in the water, as a whale would be, sound travels 4 times faster in water than it does in air. And in this case, they can actually probably, as you claimed, actually pick up calls from individuals that are maybe more like nearly 1,000 kilometers away, but certainly hundreds of kilometers. Why would you bother? Well, the point is that for these kind of animals, very often the female is only in estrus, is only capable of getting pregnant 4 days out of every 4 years. And if you're a male, you need to know about it. Because the whole point about being able to hear in these frequencies as well is that you can pick up all sorts of other things, like the low frequency vibrations from earth tremors and storms. So these animals can pick up impending storms, or even maybe rain falling hundreds of miles away almost, well before we could without instruments. At the other end of the spectrum, there are the ultrasound abilities. Now, ultrasound, very, very small wavelengths, okay? And they are actually not capable of penetrating things. That's why they're used for echoes, bouncing off things. So they're only good for short-range communication, but they're very easy to focus. And bats, here, go out to 120 kilohertz. Now, we can't hear anything like that, so this is only a sort of simulation of what it's like. Mice, 100 kilohertz, 5 times what we can hear. Dolphins, 100 kilohertz. And then cats, 64, dogs, 45. So they can all hear things that we just are not aware of at all. Now, what's it used for? Well, actually, small rodents mainly use it for short-range communication to tell, in this case, their mothers that they are distressed. Hey, mum, come and get us. And they don't want to warn all the predators, of course, but so they hopefully will not, their sound emissions won't go that far. Alternatively, they are emitted when adults are in pain. And, a very strange case, they're actually also emitted by males after they've had sex. And I have no idea why that should be. Whether it's advertising to the female, hey, I've had it, you know, you can go away, find somebody else, or whether it's actually some kind of, oh, I'm really, you know, really tired, and this is it, sort of indirect pain. I've no idea. The point is, it does actually make them slightly susceptible to predators, because all of the predators, the ones we know about, the cats and the dogs, they don't communicate with ultrasound. They only develop the ability to hear it simply because that allows them to catch the rodents that are actually using it to communicate. Okay? Now, the most sophisticated use of hearing is the so-called biosonar, which is some people call echolocation. And just to give you some statistics on it, it's a very complicated field, so I'm only going to give you a flavour of it, and you can read my transcript for a little bit more detail about how bats do it. They actually, the insect bats do this, not the fruit ones, the insect-catching bats. 300 to 600 insects per hour they can catch. And if you think that sometimes these guys live in colonies of 20 million, you can imagine how many insects that is. They are pretty good at exterminating insects. Don't get rid of the bats. Okay. Detection to catch time, and they can detect insects at about 4 meters away with this ultrasound, is about half a second. It's really fast. And it's all done at 20 to 30 miles an hour, flying around and avoiding everything. And it's done in the dark, complete dark. And in fact, they don't need to see at all to do it. If they can't use their eyes, what they have with them, it doesn't make any difference whatsoever. So how do they do it? Well, they produce this call, this focus call, this ultrasonic call, which is narrow. It's a narrow beam which can bounce off anything, even something as small as a fly or insect. And the way they do it is they use a bass call at 30 kilohertz with integer harmonics at 60, 90, and 120. But the most important one is this 60. Now they're moving and the fly is moving, and so what happens is that the returning echo that they get from their call is Doppler shifted upwards. So the frequency of it in this case is slightly higher when it comes back than the frequency with which the call was emitted. And the animal can tell where the fly is in relation to itself, not only, of course, from where the echo is being received from one or the other ears to detect phase differences, but also by the amount of the Doppler shift in the frequency, and of course as well as how long it takes for the echo to come back. It's computing all of that information to range and distance and speed all in the half second that it's got to complete the task. And of course, it would be a bit disappointing if you're your average bat if you didn't know what it was that was going to come into your mouth when you got it. Really disappointingly, how are you going to do diet preference if you're going to diet selectivity? So in fact, not only do you get a situation where a stationary fly generates a much less complex 60 hertz, in this case, echo, than the same fly when it's actually in flight and it's flapping its wings, because the wings are actually disturbing the echo. But different flies actually have different signatures from their wing beats. So by processing the echo, they not only tell where it is, how near they are, exactly what direction it is, but also what it is, whether it's their favourite tipple or not. The other thing about it is they're all flying up there, and yeah, you can hear a bit, and you can hear lots of wings and so forth, but actually this is many hundreds of decibels. They call very, very loud, especially that 60 kilohertz component. It's the equivalent of being in here with a rock band, status quo in this case. It really is amazing if you were able to hear it. And as I've already shown you, a huge amount of their brain is dedicated to processing auditory information, particularly this all-important 60 kilohertz component of the echo, which is the loudest intensity one, and that's the one they use most to determine where the echo is and what time it is. And it's even more complicated than that, but I won't go into great detail, but there are secondary maps, and they compute not just whether one frequency of echo is detected, but whether two are detected in sequence. So you have to have 30 kilohertz. The starting point's always 30 kilohertz, because that's what the animal is evoking itself. That's its signature. It's personal. I know that's my 30 kilohertz sound. And it then has cells which are detecting when 60 kilohertz hits it as well. But not only that, it's how long after the 30 kilohertz component is that the 60 kilohertz component is. And this allows, when the bat is moving towards the fly, when it's about 6 meters away, the cells in this part of its map are activated. And then as it gets progressively closer, it moves as a wave across the whole of the area, so that the animal has actually got a sort of spatial map of it approaching, like a flight path, if you like, down towards the fly. Dolphins are actually very similar, but we know less about them. They have some differences, though. In the first place, rather than using those fixed frequencies, they actually use broadband ultrasonics, which must be an awful lot more difficult for them to interpret. It simply means there's a huge range of different frequencies that they emit. They actually seem to emit the noises through their nose. And the other thing that they do, which is different, is although they have vestigial ears, they don't use them. In fact, it would be extremely difficult to do so in water. In fact, what they do is they hear things through their lower jaw. The lower jaw is actually connected through fat, a sort of impedance matching fat, to the last of those three ear bones, the stirrup. And that's how they hear. They don't need their other two ear bones at all. They're better at long distance, which is better the conditions in the water anyway, and they possibly can detect objects of maybe that kind of size, 5 centimeters or less, 100 meters or so away. And it's also been claimed that because of the nature of sound traveling in water, that at close range, they can maybe even do what an ultrasound would do if you go to a maternity hospital. They can actually detect the outline of your internal organs. So, for example, a scan here of the baby. And it's thought that possibly that's why they're so interested in pregnant women that are in the water with them, It's not necessarily the only reason you can speculate, but it's possible that they actually may be able to visualize, using ultrasound at close range anyway, the internal organs, the lungs, in this case, a baby, for example. That moves us conveniently to the most complicated system, and I really only am going to give it some sort of cursory treatment, which is vision, but also magnetoreception. In this case, we know, of course, that the most important organ is the eye, and the receptors in the retina are of two basic types. They are the so-called the rods, which are for general light and for very, very important for night vision, and there are far more of them in most other species compared to ourselves, because almost all other mammals are better at night vision than we are. And there are co-receptors, which are really daylight receptors, that depending on the species you're looking at, will be selectively able to detect different wavelengths. For example, in our case, we're talking about blue, green, and red, for example, with trichromats. The visual fields are reversed around, so what you see on the left side of your visual field is actually crossed in the optic nerves and processed by the brain in the right-hand side, and vice versa. And a huge amount of the brain is actually dedicated to sorting out vision, because, as I mentioned before, it actually has very small numbers of different receptor types. There are lots of receptors, but not many different types in the eye, so the brain has to sort it all out. And that's why you can very easily show the way that vision is processed makes loads of computational assumptions and does all sorts of things at the brain level to correct the way we see the world. The simplest, of course, is that in fact the image on the retina is upside down, but I'm sure none of you see me or anyone else in the room upside down. The brain turns it conveniently back up again for you. The other thing is that where the optic nerves actually come out of the eye, there's a hole in your retina, and that's your blind spot. You can demonstrate it with sophisticated ways, but you're not aware of it, and that's because the brain fills the gaps in for you. And the other thing that you can show is these vast array of visual illusions to show that the brain is trying desperately all the time to interpret what it's seeing and then coming up with a conclusion. So do you see faces, or do you see a candlestick in the middle here? This is the so-called Thatcher illusion, which is really hard to get your head around, but if you just look at these two here, Margaret Thatcher's head upside down, they look pretty similar, don't they? But in fact, if you turn them the right way up, what's happened is that Margaret Thatcher's eyes were in fact turned upside down. They were cut and pasted upside down, as was her mouth. And you can see that here, but you can't see it up here. The brain is making all sorts of assumptions about how Margaret Thatcher should appear upside down, which in fact are not correct. Just like the other systems, all your aspects of the visual world are mapped in fact, multiple visual areas. So this gives you an example of a pattern being seen by a monkey, and you can see exactly the same pattern in its visual cortex at the back of the brain. You can see here these different stripes. Similarly, in a human imaging study here, you can see the different colours located at different points. It's a very modular system, and it works in parallel. It's too complicated to go into, but the point is that you are separately processing form, shape, motion and texture. And lesions or damage to any part of this system can give you a selective inability to, for example, see colour or to see motion even. For example, a lady pouring out a cup of a thermos of tea into a cup. Now we would see the stream moving. She sees it as frozen. She can't see movement. You can get these highly specific deficits, but they're all modular, but you can interrupt one of them without stopping visual awareness completely. Okay. Also, just to complicate matters still further, we have different systems in the brain for computing what something is that a face, an object of a particular sort, and where it is in visual space. So your what and your where are dealt with by separate parts of your brain. Just to give an idea of complexity further is because that we all have different positions of our eyes. We have forward-facing eyes like most predators do, which gives you a great degree of binocular overlap, which gives you greater visual acuity in your frontal eye fields. But a lot of other species, especially ones that are preyed on, end up with eyes that are more laterally facing. And this, in some cases, the snake here, but also the sheep, for example, ends up with nearly 360-degree vision. Imagine what that must be like. But because there's a trade-off, they actually end up with a smaller amount of their visual field overlapping, where they can really bring things into focus and use their acuity. But it's extremely good in detecting anything around you, far better than our own. The other thing is, I've already mentioned mammals have a lot more of those rods in their eyes than cones than we do. The other thing is that a lot of them have an actual part or feature of their eye called a tapetum, which reflects light back in the eye onto the retina, and that's why their eyes shine in the dark. They have a second bite of the cherry. The light hits the retina, bounces back, and then it gets bounced back again. So that's why they have much better night vision than we do. And in fact, this rod system also allows them to detect movement far better than we do as well. Of course, that means that as a trade-off, they have less of the cones, which are allowing the acuity vision in daylight. So for the most part, most of them are far less good than we are. And this is an example of it here, human, looking at this picture here, compared to a horse, which is about at 0.6 bar acuity, sheep, right down to a cat, which can hardly see as much as we can. They're about the equivalent to 2100 vision. Of course, they also have different abilities to detect colour. We have trichromatic vision, which allows us particularly to see in the red areas of the spectrum, but most of these animals don't. And that means, in fact, that the way they don't see red at all. A bull wouldn't see red, for example. What they actually see is sort of yellow compared to us. So we do experience the world very differently. The cat down the bottom here possibly has trichromatic vision, but it has so few receptors that it has a very washed out view of the world, very pastelized. As far as other aspects of vision are concerned, I'll only mention them briefly. We can't detect things in either ultraviolet, which for example bees use to detect the position of the sun, even though they can't see it, through the level of polarization coming through the atmosphere, or infrared, because we're warm-blooded, so snakes can detect in infrared. So these give the animals, these particular animals, another aspect on life. This is the same flower seen in UV compared to normal. Okay. But we can't do it, but nor can other mammals. As far as navigation using magnetic fields is concerned, then again this is a complicated area. But a number of species now appear to be able to find their way over large distances by computing changes in magnetic fields. And it's been known in birds and insects for a while, but only more recently has it started to be accepted in mammals, the migratory sorts, particularly the sort of whales and wildebeest here, and some rodents, as I'll come back to in a moment. In humans, it's been claimed that we have some ability to do this, although apparently we're better at telling north and south if we're either wearing no clothes or we're wearing cotton, not if we're wearing nylon. So there you go. And you're better if you sleep north to south as well. But only one study has ever really shown it. In terms of trying to find out what it is that detects magnetic fields, then the most accepted one is actually we have biological magnets, and these were first discovered on Earth at least in bacteria, and that explains their orientation, north-south orientation. But they've actually in fact been found in fragments of meteorites coming from Mars, which is one of the reasons that they suggest that there was life on Mars, because these same biological magnets, they're not found in nature, are actually found in fish like trout. And they appear to be linked into the brain, and that's what helps them guide their way upstreams to get back to spawning sites and so forth, using magnetic fields.